So welcome back to the channel after the slight pause. Life has been coming at me fast this past month, but now we're moving forward once again. This video is actually going to be the intro section for the next major lore vid for the channel, but whilst editing away this week, I just came to realise that for one, it runs kinda long, and two, that it would actually make more sense as a standalone video, almost something of a trailer for what's coming up next. And also, I think this one works well as a good first video for 2023, a refresher of sorts. Now, whenever I start a lengthy lore video, I usually want to try and provide some element of context as to what we're getting into, for myself as much as the audience. But with this intro, it started going off on adjacent thoughts about how we came to where we are and why, thinking about the transition between recent editions of the game itself and how the lore has been advanced recently versus in the past. Within the verse of 40k, there is a great wealth of material that focuses upon or directly describing what are technically past events for mankind, even though it is in the future from our perspective. Events such as the dark descent of humanity from its seemingly unbreakable zenith of scientific, cultural, mental and ideological enlightenment into a dark, depressing age of ignorance, suffering, prejudice, horror and oppression. That despite the many glorious tales that are told to us about the origins, arrival and salvation of humanity by the Emperor of Mankind, in many respects this did little though other than to slow down humanity's slide into the darkest pits of the human condition, made it worse actually. And then we had the self-destructive civil war of the Horus Heresy, the apostasy, now the extreme puritanical zealotry of the smothering imperial religion, enforced by the Ecclesiarchy Ministorum Sororitas. As things stand now in M41, we are presented with an ever-expanding series detailing what we might wish to call current events within the 40k verse. In the past years, this has moved forward with more considerable momentum than it has done previously, including recent new additions such as the first in the Arcs of Omen series, documenting the newest lore developments via supplementary campaign books. Now historically, within the lore of 40k, forward progress was, until recently like I say, pretty slow. Of course it did happen here and there, but it was mostly fleshing out rather than building new. For the majority of its history, the lore of 40k has moved forward at a truly glacial speed. Not much realistically having changed since the second edition of 40k way back when. To be clear though, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Fast-tracked lore expansion can lead to terrible choices or material that just ends up watered down on details if it's pushed too fast, or you just end up with a mess that doesn't make sense. Now, simultaneously of course, we do want things to progress and not just to stagnate. So there has to be a happy medium somewhere, somehow. But seriously, progression of lore was few and far between until the 8th edition. And this new vanguard of forward lore was truly invigorating and refreshing. It really pulled a lot of people back into Warhammer 40,000, because the stagnation of 40k was just one of the reasons why even I tuned out of 40k during around the 5th and 7th editions, because nothing much was going on. Little was really added in a meaningful way. There was new material of course, but little that really moved things forward. And I do think this highlighted an important thing, which is that as much as sometimes it can be painful when new events come around, it can change established narratives in a dramatic way, it's also, whether you like it or not, ultimately necessary. Because without forward progression, a fictional verse just ceases to feel like it's a living thing. It becomes stagnant. The oxygen of the narrative is all consumed. Once you've consumed it and moved on, you're kind of done. You're left wheezing, feeling sleepy, barely able to keep your eyes open. You eventually move on to something which is actually fresh and engaging and interesting, and you think, wow, okay, I need to learn about this. So when 8th edition came along, shockingly, all the way back in 2017, we saw a massive explosion of progress. Previously unimaginable events like the catastrophic fall of Cadia, the emergence of the Inari, of course the Primaris, and the final act whereby the newly restored Primarch of the Ultramarines would take total command of the Imperium, albeit at the apex of a new dark age for humanity as the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the galaxy apart. Later would come the Indomitus Crusade, the Psychic Awakening, trivial issues like the Cauldron of War seen in Octarius. I'm being sarcastic because it didn't go as far as I wanted it to, and of course the ongoing events centered around the Nachmund Gauntlet and the Imperial Bastion world known as Vigilus. Now, as you may recall, I did cover the fall of Cadia and emergence of the Inari, but not really as a dedicated series. It was somehow woven into my video about defeats of the Imperium, so I may well do that soon, even if it's more of a refresh and repackage situation, because a lot of people are coming into 40k at the moment, and it's something that's pretty important. One thing I have been asked about before though is why haven't I jumped onto the new material of 8th, or really made any significant content and thoughts about the expanding story. Well, in truth, it's because I was waiting to see if this was going to be a genuinely solid new direction for the lore. And you might think, well, Luton, you've waited quite a while for that. It's true, but I wanted to really see if it was going to yield some kind of unprecedented forward-moving development, or if it was going to be, as has happened previously, a flash in the pan followed by years of silence, punctuated with Space Marine battles and filler campaigns, which, whilst interesting, didn't contribute really much going forward. So when I'm thinking about this overall, the lore tends to be around for a long time. I really didn't feel any rush to jump onto this because it's actually one of the best things about 40k is that it's so massive even as it stands. There's always plenty of long established interesting material to digest in the meanwhile, which is why you'll notice a lot of my videos go off on these kind of meandering adjacent topics that are more sort of metaphysical or whatever, because that's kind of interesting. All the other stuff's still there, we can get to it anytime we want to. Plus I do my best to generally try not to breathlessly bandwagon unless it's something truly unmissable, or your mandatory sacrifice of self-respect for the faceless Leviathan algo god that all of us must on YouTube worship. As it turned out, what we would end up with 8th and going forward was something somewhere in the middle. Not quite as much progress as some would have wished for, but ultimately much more than we've had in the past. I'm personally still bemoaning the lack of material surrounding the Inari, one of, in my opinion, the most interesting and consequential factions in memory for 40k, but we all surely know the uphill battle of selling Xenos versus Imperial/Marines. It goes for both miniatures and the lore, unfortunately, and it's a reality that I accept, but I'm never really happy about it, because it means we often don't ever really get to dig down into the amazing prospects of learning about factions such as the Eldar, Tyranid, the Tau in more detail. But it is what it is. The audience of 40k know what they want, and what they want apparently is Space Marines. So in the aftermath of 8th edition releasing, to my pleasant surprise, the new events within the galaxy of M41 continued to progress. Admittedly still slower than some would wish, certainly not without some criticism when it came to certain expansive details, not least the Primaris, which I think actually still even now have a lot of contention about them. We have all these cynical conversations we wish about buying existing armies all over again, and how lore is little more than a thin soup meant to hold the meat of new miniatures. But like it or not, they're here to stay. But so far it turns out that the quick death of firstborn Marines was greatly exaggerated. I personally think that they've existed so far, so long in Warhammer 40,000 for them to ever truly go away, no matter how much they're written out of the lore or suffer a slow meta death at tabletop level. The nostalgia will always remain, and given that even now miniatures from 30 years ago are being sold on eBay for premium prices, not even rare stuff, I think firstborn are pretty safe probably, for my lifetime at least. What's the point of all this history? Well, for me it is important, because I care about the context of things. I think it frames a story, it sets the stage, and it tempers expectations, to just keep in mind how the lore of 40k arrives to us. And I think that this is a healthy thing to do, because when people's expectations run away with them, this is when they want too much too fast. It's a recipe for disappointment and sometimes burnout. I've said this a lot over the years. It's why whenever a new supplement comes along, I don't really hold out hope of it being a genre-defining piece of narrative. If it adds just another stone to the mountain of 40k lore, that's enough for me. I prefer to exist within that level of expectation, because I've seen how things go as we've all followed the growth of 40k over not a few years, but actual decades. And in many ways, keeping my expectations realistically is a way to help me not get burned out or disillusioned with something that I really enjoy, because I have got burned out and disillusioned with other fandoms and games in the past. And bizarrely, I have actually in fact been following 40k for most of my life, which sounds kind of weird when I actually say that out loud. Now, we all know that where we are now in 2023, people tend to start foaming at the mouth whenever anything changes too much or too little. For me, any small new detail is interesting and enjoyable, and very often amid a deluge of new book releases, there may actually only be, in a single novel, 4 to 5 paragraphs that actually add true, meaningful, new lore developments. That's not to say that the book itself doesn't have relevance, of course. It's interesting, it's added to the fictional base of 40k. But if you're somebody truly immersed in the lore, you're looking for those details. And the same can be said for campaign material. So perhaps the thought is to temper your expectations, and you'll probably enjoy things all the more. But again, of course, some people will just say, well, having high expectations is not a bad thing, and it's not an invalid statement, for sure. But I think as with most things, it has to be a balance, isn't it? And that's really up to everybody as an individual to find what is their own level of balance and expectation. And I always think the truest way to make your voice heard is voting with your wallet. If you enjoy something, support it. If you don't, well then don't. If you enjoy a new author Black Library is trialing for the first time, tell people about them. Get them to go purchase their ebook from Black Library, because it's the only way you're going to see more of them. The same goes for narrative in general. If we want to see more Xenos, we need to show it. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. The thing is, the vast wealth of lore that exists for 40k didn't arrive overnight, delivered complete in 100 immortal tomes, nor has it come to us with a regular, predictable, yearly, satisfying leap forward at the launch of every single edition. The verse of 40k as it stands came to us through 30 years of drips of information, often via installments of lore far less than you might see in a supplementary campaign book today. The world was built through small article-adjacent stories in White Dwarf, quotations lying within the margins of a codex, campaign backgrounds, adjacent games material like Necromunda, RPG series, special events, of course some novels, and very often some of the most hard-to-find short stories and small audio exclusives. I spent so many years when I was younger reading, rereading copies of this early material that they literally fell apart. As you can see here, this was my very first copy of White Dwarf. I still have it, and you can see it's basically destroyed. Thankfully, I later picked up a mint condition copy for my library of lore. The novels of the 40k verse also add some of the most expansive character development. There are too many to name, but we have seen such a huge, truly amazing library of material when it comes to 40k that there are innumerable characters who define their factions and are now permanently embedded forever in the audience. Think of Eisenhorn, Trazen, think Gazgul, Loken, Garrow, and on and on. Please tell me your faction-defining character in the comments below. Maybe I can include it on the next character spotlight, for example. Now, as I've noted previously, some of the most weighty background lore comes to us from supplementary material. And I'll spare you my usual speech about how you should be sure to pick up new supplements because they're never around for long and so on. But case in point, some of the most defining lore material for 40k only exists now in the long out of print tomes such as Imperial Armor and the Heresy Black Books, which I can't deny happily sit complete within my own library. These are the legendary hardback supplements from Forge World, which forged if you will, a heavy foundation for 40k lore. And I always think it's a real shame that in the grand scheme of things, these are likely only able to be owned by a small percentage of the overall 40k audience. They're so enjoyable as lore material, important in the history of 40k, that I really feel everybody should have an opportunity somehow to own them. Anyway, I always get close to going onto a rant when I think about how such critical lore material that made 40k what it is can often remain largely unavailable to access in any form. Look at out-of-print books like Xenology or Tactica Imperialis, for example. So it's a real shame that these can often remain largely unavailable to access in any form, and whilst it's true that series such as The Psychic Awakening didn't land as well as they might have, supplements like Octarius, which was enjoyable but didn't go as deep as we might have wished, it all continues to build the picture. And that for me, overall, in the grand scheme of things, is what I tend to think about. It's a net positive overall. Now, small adjacent rant, I've never quite understood the decision to release the Gathering Storm supplements at the start of 8th in such a limited print run. What these are, they laid out the critical bedrock of the modern 40k verse, the fall of Cadia, rise of the Inari, return of Guilliman. only to go out of print and be barely available anywhere until recently via the Warhammer Plus site. But even then, I think those were changed a little, they stripped out some stuff. I think they were available on the barely spoken about Warhammer Digital site, which I've never really understood because it bizarrely remains a thing despite Black Library being the core online portal for digital 40k literature. Games Workshop's confusing with their websites. But anyway, suffice to say, just very glad that I picked up a copy of Gathering Storm, as I did at the beginning. And so yes, that's my point about picking up supplements. But why it was not produced later as some kind of, for example, omnibus edition stripped of the campaign rules and just the lore, why that didn't happen is beyond me. I always think it must be very frustrating for somebody coming into 40k much later and realizing there's all this material that they have now no real means of accessing. And even often when I've had people ask me, where can I find out about this? Where can I get this material? And I just have to say, oh, you can't get it now. Which seems very weird, because this kind of material is truly so important and expansive for the lore. I mean, it really is the critical bedrock of the verse. How can that not be available? I've not understood that. These kind of supplement campaigns always use more direct use of storytelling language than that of a novel as well. I suppose you might say they're more story-driven than character-driven, but I've never particularly liked that phrasing. Character novels are still story-driven. I think what you could say is that some stories are simply better at building a broader picture for the audience, or they're more focused on the broader picture. Which brings us to the Vigilus series and what I'll be focused on next for the channel. Because the Vigilus series was about as close as any new material came to adding a weighty lore campaign as seen in Imperial Armor or the Heresy books. It didn't quite get there, but it was pretty close. Vigilus came to us in two pretty solid books compared to more traditional supplements, about twice as heavy, and they laid out the first critical engagements for the Imperium post Cicatrix Maledictum, that is to say 8th edition onwards. And similarly to the Gathering Storm books, Vigilus was of course available in physical and digital formats, but unlike the Gathering Storm trilogy, the physical books were nowhere near as difficult to acquire once out of print. You can still get them pretty easily now. But then nor were they as critical to understanding the events of the 40k galaxy post Cicatrix. So after a long time, I felt this to be a good juncture to explore the events surrounding Vigilus, and I plan to then move on to the Rift War and into the current Imperial Crucible Arcs of Omen. Because with the arrival of this trilogy, I believe, as many are speculating, it's the opening salvo that will set us up for a transition into the next edition of 40k, that is to say the 10th edition. And if it's going to make any sense at all for me to look at that when it arrives, it seemed both apt and necessary to explore Vigilus. The difficulty, however, when it comes to the broader picture of the Era Indomitus lore, is that it remains fragmented across what I would classify as your Tier 1 novels, usually penned by the heavyweight, long-established authors, things such as the Dark Imperium trilogy, Dawn of Fire, and so on, and then you get down into your novellas, your short story collections, and then you have the now apparently anonymous in-house supplementary campaign material like Nachmund, Octarius, Charadon. Now, I'm not applying any tier-ordered weight or judgment to the format of content delivery, by the way. I just find it's helpful to think of those formats with some distinction because they usually contribute to the broad picture of the lore differently. Vigilus came to us in the latter format of supplementary campaign books, and as I noted, their format certainly does not diminish their contribution, for they held a hefty amount of lore and laid out the first critical engagements for the Imperium post Cicatrix Maledictum, as well as helping us build a picture of just what the hell was going on for the Imperium with the galaxy torn apart. So following this video very soon, emphasis on genuinely very soon, I will start the first in not a necessarily back-to-back series, looking at this series onward eventually into Arcs of Omen. Vigilus is an Imperial world that through the twisting strands of fate found itself cast to the dark side of the Great Rift, within the new domain now designated as the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. It had stood as a powerful bastion world for millennia. Its entire production output was geared to warfare, and it contained heavy regiments of Imperial Guard, Sororitas, and Mechanicus. But if Cadia had been the keystone which had long kept the Eye of Terror in check, Vigilus would soon become its adjacent successor, for it now held the keys to the gateway that could determine the entire fate for Imperium Nihilus. Inevitably, it would soon be deluged by a broad spectrum of enemies that would see the outbreak of an immense war between the forces of the Imperium and some of the most reprehensible Xenos and the darkest horrors of the Warp. with the long-standing leadership representing the interests of its multiple hive sprawls that covered the planet's surface, housing many billions of Imperial citizens. Its hive, psi fields and bastion-grade force fields could protect against oncoming enemies, as they had for many millennia, so it seemed a foregone conclusion that they could hold out against even the most aggressive Xenos assaults, certainly until reinforcements could arrive. Yet now, with the galaxy torn asunder, the light of the Astronomicon extinguished for those with Imperium Nihilus, for the Imperials even reaching Vigilus will take an extraordinary miracle. And for those upon Vigilus, they would face not merely enemies from outside off-world, but also they faced dark enemies from within. The long and bleak story of Vigilus follows very soon. So as always, I'll see you then in the next one.